The rain fell hard on the stone steps of St. Margaret's Chapel, cold and steady, as if the sky itself refused to show mercy. Lady Elelena Ashford stood in her ivory wedding gown, her thin slippers already soaked through. The damp crept into her bones, but it was not the cold that made her hands tremble. It was the truth she could no longer escape. This marriage was not born of love. It was a transaction, plain and final. Beside her stood Adrian Blackwell, the Duke of Ravensmore. He was tall, rigid, and distant, his dark hair perfectly set, his gray eyes fixed on nothing that concerned her. As the vicar spoke the vows, Adrian's mind seemed elsewhere, counting figures, measuring losses, calculating gains. His voice held no warmth when he promised honor and care. When he placed the ring on her finger, his touch was brief and cold. When he lifted her veil, his lips barely brushed her cheek, more polite than intimate, like sealing a business deal. The whispers behind them told the rest of the story. Her father had been dead only 6 months. Everyone knew it. Everyone knew of the vast shipping empire Lord Thomas Ashford had built with his own hands. Tea, silk, spices, ships that crossed oceans and made fortunes. And everyone knew the Duke of Ravensmore needed money. His ancient title could not hide the truth of failing lands and growing debt. Elelena understood it all with painful clarity. When Adrian had first come calling weeks after her father's funeral, his sympathy had been stiff and formal. His proposal had come not with romance, but with careful timing. He had asked for her hand in her father's study, surrounded by maps and shipping records, the real object of his interest. She had known then she was not chosen for herself, but for what she carried with her name. When the ceremony ended, she signed the register for the last time as Elelena Ashford. Adrian signed with bold strokes, the same hand that would soon command her father's ships. As the carriage carried them away through the rain, silence filled the space between them. Elelena watched her husband stare out the window, unmoved, untouched. The life she had imagined died quietly in that moment. Ravensmore Hall rose from the land like a fortress of stone and shadow. Its walls were gray, its windows cold and watchful. As the carriage rolled through the gates, Elelena felt her chest tighten. This place was not a home. It was a monument to power and distance. Mrs. Davidson, the housekeeper, greeted them with stiff courtesy. Adrian instructed her to show the Duchess to her rooms, making it clear they would be separate from his own. The chambers were grand and empty all at once. Heavy curtains, tall windows, fine furniture chosen without affection. As maids unpacked her belongings, Elelena stood by the window and looked out over the wide land stretching into darkness. She wondered if her father had ever imagined this end, that all his work would place his daughter here alone. Dinner that night confirmed everything she feared. Adrian spoke only of business, shipments, meetings, profits. He asked nothing of her comfort or thoughts. His eyes passed over her, as if she were part of the furniture. When the meal ended, he excused himself without a good night. Elelena lay awake in the dark, listening to the vast house breathe around her, feeling smaller than she ever had before. The days that followed blended into one another. Breakfast alone, walks in the garden under fading autumn leaves, silent dinners across a table too long for closeness. Adrian rode early and returned late. He spoke with stewards and clerks, always about trade and numbers. Elelena became invisible, and invisibility carried its own quiet pain. One afternoon, wandering through unused corridors, she discovered her father's portrait hidden away in a storage room, facing a wall. In its place in the hall hung shipping maps marked in his hand. The roots were honored. The man was not. Something hardened in her chest as she stood there, grief mixing with quiet anger. In the library she found old ledgers. The truth stared back at her from the pages. Ravensmore was failing. Debt pressed in from every side. Adrian had not married her out of greed alone, but desperation. He had been close to ruin. The knowledge did not excuse his coldness, but it explained it. She found her father's letters next, written to Adrian during the courtship. They spoke of hope, of trust, of care for his daughter. Elelonina wept openly then, mourning not only her father, but the future he had believed possible for her. She realized Adrian had never asked what she knew, never considered that she had been trained beside her father, learning routes, winds, and markets. Days later she dared to speak. She offered a small suggestion about a shipping route to Mr. Thornton, the steward. He dismissed her gently, as one humors a child. The frustration burned deep. She was losing more than affection. She was losing herself. Then one evening something changed. Adrian sat at dinner with a telegram crushed in his hand. His face was tight with strain. He drank more than usual. Finally, unable to bear the silence, Elelonina asked if the news was bad. He slid the paper across to her. One of the largest ships was missing, weeks overdue. A fortune lost if it did not return. She read the route and felt dread settle in her stomach. It was the Northern Passage, dangerous in autumn. Her father had avoided it after losing a ship years before. She spoke quietly, carefully. Adrian listened, truly listened. For the first time, his attention fixed fully on her. When she finished, something broke in his expression. He left the table without a word. That night, she found him asleep at his desk, papers scattered around him. Without thinking, she placed a blanket over his shoulders. The gesture surprised even her. 2 months into the marriage, Adrian announced they would travel to Portsmouth. The road carried them through forests and mist. At an inn along the way, the keeper warned of bandits. Adrian dismissed the concern. Elelonina felt unease she could not explain. The next morning, the forest closed in around the narrow road. The quiet felt wrong. Then chaos erupted. Masked riders burst from the trees. Gunfire cracked the air. Adrian threw himself over Elelonina as shots rang out. Pain struck her side with shocking force. Warmth spread across her dress. She looked down and saw blood. The world tilted. Through the haze, she saw Adrian's face above hers, fear raw and unguarded. He called her by her name, not her title, her name. Darkness closed in as his hands pressed against her wound, and in that moment, as consciousness slipped away, Elelonina knew something had changed forever. Adrian's world narrowed to the weight in his arms, and the blood soaking through his coat. The bandits were gone, their horses, thunder fading into the forest, but none of that mattered. The driver groaned somewhere behind him, alive at least, but Elelonina lay limp against his chest, her breath shallow and uneven. Fear, unlike anything he had known, seized him, sharp and absolute. This was not a failing estate or a missed shipment. This was her life slipping away. He pressed his coat harder against the wound, his hands shaking as he called her name again and again. Not Duchess, not my wife, Eleanor. The name felt like a plea torn from his chest. The driver, bloodied but conscious, gasped that there was a village with a doctor miles back the way they had come. 20 miles, perhaps more. Adrian did not hesitate. He stripped off his coat, bound it tight, and lifted her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, frighteningly so. Her head fell against his shoulder, her blood warm against his waistcoat. He began to walk. The forest road stretched endlessly before him, a ribbon of dirt and fallen leaves under a sky that felt too wide and too indifferent. His arms ached almost at once, a deep burning pain that radiated through his shoulders. Still, he did not slow. He talked to her as he walked, his voice rough and urgent, telling her to stay, begging her not to leave him. Sometimes she stirred, a faint sound escaping her lips, and those small signs of life became the only thing that mattered. As the hours passed, his body screamed for rest, but his mind refused it. Memories rose unbidden, their wedding day, her pale face under the chapel light. How he had barely looked at her, How he had thought only of ships and figures and survival. Shame cut through him sharper than exhaustion. He remembered the dinners where she sat across from him in silence, her quiet attempts at conversation brushed aside. He had treated her like a piece of furniture, useful only because it existed. She murmured in her delirium, her father's name falling from her lips with aching longing. The sound struck him like a blow. He had never once asked about her grief, never acknowledged the weight she carried. He had taken everything her father built and ignored the daughter who loved him. He stumbled, nearly falling, and tightened his grip, whispering apologies she could not hear, promises he had never thought to make spilled from him. He promised to see her, to value her, to be better, if only she would live. Darkness fell as he walked on, the road barely visible under the moonlight. His legs trembled, his breath came in harsh gasps. Twice he nearly collapsed. Each time the thought of setting her down was unbearable. He would rather die on that road than let her go. At some point, exhaustion overwhelmed even fear. He sank to his knees, her body cradled against him, his whole frame shaking. The temptation to rest, to surrender, pressed in hard. He looked down at her face, pale and still, and despair threatened to crush him. Then, something inside him hardened into resolve. He could not accept a world without her. The realization came with terrifying clarity. Somewhere in those quiet weeks he had ignored, she had become essential. He rose again, legs barely holding him, and forced himself forward. He spoke to her through the night. He told her about Ravensmore in spring, about gardens in bloom, about a future he had never planned before. He spoke as if words could tether her to life, and somehow they did. Dawn came pale and uncertain. Through the thinning mist, he saw lights ahead, a village. Hope surged through him so fiercely it nearly brought him to tears. His pace quickened, despite the agony tearing through his body. Eleanor stirred, her eyes fluttering open, unfocused but alive. "You carried me," she whispered, wonder in her voice. "I would have carried you 1,000, he answered without thinking, the truth of it shocking him. He reached the doctor's house and pounded on the door with his shoulder, refusing to release her. When it opened, he carried her inside and laid her down with infinite care. The moment her weight left his arms, his strength vanished. Darkness took him. He woke hours later in a chair, pain flaring through every muscle. Panic drove him upright. He found her in the next room, bandaged and pale, but breathing. The doctor spoke calmly, explaining that the bullet had missed her vital organs by inches. She lived, though the danger was not past. Adrian sank into the chair beside her bed and took her hand. He did not let go. The days blurred into a vigil. He slept in broken moments, waking at every change in her breathing. He cooled her fever, read to her, spoke to her constantly. The doctor remarked on his devotion with quiet wonder. Adrian barely heard him. Nothing existed beyond the bed and the woman lying in it. When her fever finally broke, relief flooded him so completely he nearly collapsed. She opened her eyes, clear this time, and looked at him as if seeing him for the first time. "You stayed," she said, disbelief threading her voice. "Always," he answered, and meant it. As her strength slowly returned, silence no longer filled the space between them. One afternoon she asked the question that had waited too long. "Why did you marry me, Adrian?" He told her the truth, about the debts, the desperation, the cold calculation. He did not soften it. She listened without surprise, only sadness. When he finished, he added what mattered most. "I was wrong. I saw only what you could give, not who you are." She asked him who he was then, and for the first time in his life he answered honestly. He spoke of a childhood without warmth, of learning early that feeling was weakness. She spoke of her father, of grief, of the knowledge she carried that no one wanted to see. They met each other at last, not as titles or assets, but as people. When he told her he would give up everything to keep her safe, she did not answer at once. She asked for time, he gave it, hope and fear warring inside him. Weeks later, when she was strong enough to travel, they returned slowly to Ravensmore. The journey was nothing like the first. Conversation filled the carriage. Respect replaced distance. At the inn where they had once slept apart, she chose to share a room, and the relief on his face told her everything. Back at Ravensmore Hall, changes followed. Her father's portrait was returned to a place of honor. Doors once closed were left open. Meals were shared. Decisions were made together. The house, once cold and echoing, began to breathe. Months passed, then years. 3 years after the blood-soaked road, Elena stood in the garden, watching their small daughter toddle among the roses. Adrian watched from the terrace, his heart full in a way he had never believed possible. The scar on her side ached sometimes. He always noticed. He always apologized. "I am not sorry," she always replied. "It reminds me of the night you carried me, of the moment you became truly my husband." And as they stood together, their child between them, Ravensmore Hall glowed warm in the fading light, no longer a monument to cold ambition, but a home built from courage, repentance, and a love born in darkness and carried into the light. Spring returned to Ravensmore Hall with quiet determination, pushing green shoots through soil that had long known only restraint and order. The gardens, once trimmed with cold precision, softened under Eleanor's care. She planted flowers her father had loved, choosing colors for warmth rather than fashion. Adrian watched these changes with a sense of awe, as though the land itself was learning to breathe again. Life settled into a new rhythm, fragile at first, then steady. Breakfasts were taken together in the morning room where sunlight spilled across the table. Adrian no longer hid behind ledgers. He asked Eleanor's thoughts, listened without interruption, and acted on her counsel. The shipping business began to change under their shared management. Routes adjusted with care rather than haste. Partnerships renewed with trust instead of pressure. Slowly, almost quietly, Ravensmore's fortunes improved. But the greater change was not measured in profits. One evening, as Eleanor rested by the fire, Adrian knelt before her, his expression solemn in a way that carried no distance. He took her hands, scarred now by healing, and spoke with the same raw honesty that had carried him through the forest months before. "I need to say this plainly," he said, "not as a duke, not as a man who owes you his future, but as someone who loves you." The word hung between them, unadorned and real. "I love you," he repeated, "not for what you brought to me, not for what you saved, but for who you are, for your strength, your patience, your courage." Eleanor felt tears rise, not from pain, but from recognition. She had waited so long to be seen. She rested her forehead against his and answered softly, "I love you too, not because you carried me, though that saved my life, but because you chose to change." From that night on, there was no question between them. Their marriage, once hollow, became deliberate and alive. They disagreed at times. Old habits surfaced. But they faced each conflict openly, choosing conversation over silence, truth over comfort. When Eleanor discovered she was expecting a child, Adrian reacted not with calculation, but with wonder so pure it stole her breath. He was afraid in ways he had never been afraid before, not of loss or failure, but of not being enough. Eleanor steadied him, reminding him that love was learned in action, not perfection. Their daughter Catherine arrived on a warm spring morning, her cry filling the house with sound that banished the last echoes of emptiness. Adrian held his child with reverence, tears slipping freely down his face. Eleanor watched him and knew without doubt that the man who once feared feeling had become someone capable of deep, unwavering devotion. Years passed gently. Ravensmore Hall became a place of laughter and light. Servants spoke in hushed tones of the Duke's transformation, of the way his voice softened when he spoke to his wife, of the way he knelt in the garden to let his daughter place flowers in his hands. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, Eleanor would trace the scar on her side, the dull ache reminding her of the road through the forest, of blood and fear and desperate footsteps in the dark. Adrian always noticed. He always tightened his arm around her and whispered an apology that never grew old. "I am not sorry," she would tell him, just as she always had. "That scar is where our truth began." One late afternoon, 3 years after that terrible journey, Eleanor stood in the garden watching Catherine chase a butterfly with fierce determination. Adrian descended the terrace steps, a letter forgotten in his hand, his attention fixed only on the scene before him. Eleanor turned, sensing his gaze, and smiled. It was a smile born not of hope, but of certainty. Adrian joined her, lifting their daughter into his arms. Catherine laughed, reaching for her mother. The three of them stood together, framed by flowers and warm light, the past no longer a shadow but a foundation. Ravensmore Hall glowed behind them, no longer cold stone but a living home shaped by forgiveness, effort, and love chosen daily. Adrian kissed Eleanor's temple and said quietly, "I almost lost everything before I understood what mattered." Eleanor leaned into him and answered, "Sometimes love does not arrive gently. Sometimes it asks us to walk through darkness first." They stood there as evening settled, content in the knowledge that what began as a transaction had become a bond deeper than intention, stronger than fear. A love not born perfect, but made real through courage, honesty, and the willingness to stay when leaving would have been easier. And in that choice, made again and again, they found a happiness neither had believed possible.